pyramid or on top of the mountain then? Do you would agree on that?
Yes, because everything in Egyptian theology was not only dualist, but could be read in two ways, in two fashions. So it became very convoluted, very complicated. And I think you can look at this symbolism in two fashions. I think the original symbolism was that the all-seeing eye was probably associated with the third pyramid. And I don't know if you know that, but all of the pyramidions, they're the little capstones that go on the top of the pyramid.
Sure.
They all had the two eyes of Ra on them, inscribed on them. So the very top of the pyramid would have the eye of Ra.
Yeah.
So exactly as you see on the back of the $1 note.
Sure.
And exactly as you see on the first degree tracing board. But on the top of the Great Pyramid, I'm pretty sure that this had a platform on the top. It was the unfinished pyramid. And for a reason, because Egyptian theology is all about astronomy, or astrology, if you'd like to call it in that fashion, but it was as much astronomy as it was astrology. And so you would need a viewing platform if you were going to do any serious astrology. And the Great Pyramid, of course, would provide the best platform possible in Egypt for viewing the heavens. It would be above the smog of all the little fires brewing their cups of tea down below. And it would have the first sight, of course, of Ra as he came over the horizon, long before anyone on the ground would see Ra. So it would be an ideal viewing platform. So I'm pretty sure that the priesthood would have gone to the top of the Great Pyramid, and they would probably, as a part of their ritual, because we know this ritual came down through Judaic tradition, they may well have made sacrifices on the top of there as well, a little bit like the Central American people made sacrifices on the top of their pyramid.
Sure.
And so you would then have an image of a large pyramid with smoke coming out of the top of it, because they would be making sacrifices, and of course as soon as you make a sacrifice onto a fire, of course you'll get loads of smoke, etc.
Sure.
So you'd have a very volcano-like image from the Giza pyramids anyway. However, on top of that, the whole of this Exodus business occurred, the whole of this plagues and storms and all the rest of it occurred because the island of Thera exploded in about 1620 BC. Now, here we have another, as it were, pyramid with fire on the top. Here we had a real volcano.
Yeah.
I don't know how big that volcano was, but they used to call the island Kiftu, didn't they, which was the island with a pillar. That's what it meant, the island with a pillar.
Yeah.
And the pillar would have been, the steady stream of smoke, obviously, that was billowing out of the top of this volcano. Well, that volcano erupted in about 1620 BC, and it covered the whole of the Eastern Med with a huge great ash cloud. And we know that ash fell in Egypt because they found the layer of ash in northern Egypt. So we know that the ash got as far as Egypt. And here again, of course, we bring back the links with the Old Testament, because Moses says exactly the same. And I'm just trying to find the exact wording that he used, because here it is. Exodus 9:8, if anyone's got their Bibles handy. And the Lord said unto Moses and unto Aaron, Take you handfuls of ashes of the furnace, and let Moses sprinkle it towards the heaven in the sight of Pharaoh, and it shall become small dust in all of the land of Egypt. Now, what's that, if that is not the ashfall coming out of Thera?
Yeah.
That is an absolute perfect description of the ashfall from Thera. And it is that event that caused the plagues, and it is that event that caused the Exodus. So here we have the cause of the Exodus. was actually a very similar incident, imagery rather, to the Giza pyramids itself. There must have been sailors out there who were near Santorini. In fact, we know there were sailors because if you read the Epic of Jason and the Argonauts, it is a perfect description of the eruption of Thera. And of course, Jason landed on the island next door to Thera.
Yeah.
So we know where he was. He was next door to Thera. And he's describing this great beast that hurls rocks at them, you know, and they were covered in darkness during the day. For 2 whole days they were covered in darkness with this great monster throwing rocks at them. Well, what's that, if that was not the eruption of Thera?
Sure.
So you would have had sailors around that era who would have seen this pillar, this great volcano with this great eruption of fire on its summit, which the priesthood of Egypt would have recognized instantly as being the same imagery as their Mount Sinai, the same as the Great Pyramid, with the sacrifices being made on the summit. And so we have this sort of dualism here between the god being angry at Thera by using the same imagery as the priesthood were using at Egypt. Funny that, isn't it? And it was that incident, of course, that started the civil war between the Hyksos and the southern Egyptians. And we know that because the Hyksos were pushed out of Egypt only about 50 years after the eruption of Thera. So it's pretty obvious that the two were coincident. They were coincident in chronology. They were coincident in the fact that in the War of the Egyptians, which is another ancient Egyptian text, it says that the Hyksos were evicted from Egypt after a great storm came over Egypt, which is what it says on the Tempest Stela as well. And the Tempest Stela is rather interesting because it appears to have quotations from the Old Testament on it. Now, the Tempest Stela was written by Ahmose I, who was the pharaoh from southern Egypt who actually kicked the Hyksos out of Egypt. So we have this exact timing. We have Ahmose I, who lived around sort of 1570 BC. We have the Thera eruption, which was about 1620 BC. And we know that Ahmose kicked the Hyksos out of Egypt. And we know that at the same time he commissioned a stela that said that there were storms, a very unusual storm that hit Egypt and covered it in darkness for 3 days. And that was, of course, the plagues incident, exactly the same as Moses was talking about. So we have this perfect confluence of text and history. And so effectively the whole of the Bible was only written, really, because of the Thera eruption. Because these people were driven out of Egypt and they lost their homes. And so they wrote down a history of their people. And that became the Old Testament.
Fascinating. You know, would you say that, you know, the Western world, or I guess in some sense the modern world, then is a kind of spawn from Egypt, or that even our culture and architecture is an offshoot from this, you know, Hyksos culture, I guess, then?
Yes, very definitely, because in some sense it was their downfall, but in some senses it was also the downfall that made them.
Yeah. And
it even says that in the protocols of the Elders of Zion, although I'm not entirely sure it was talking about the Moses Exodus. I think it was actually talking about the sort of first century Jesus Exodus after the destruction of Jerusalem. But it says exactly the same thing, that we thought the Exodus was our downfall, but in fact it was the making of us. Because Egypt was the superpower of that region in 1500, 1550 BC. It was the superpower. And yet, a great proportion, and the texts say anything up to 1 million people, but obviously there is a tendency for exaggeration sometimes in these texts, were kicked out of Egypt. And they could have gone anywhere. And I think they did go anywhere, because I write, quite a lot about, the exodus of Queen Scota and people of that nature, which I'm sure we will come on to later.
Absolutely, yeah.
So these people were pushed out of Egypt, and they could have gone by land up towards Syria and even across to Babylon. But they may have gone out across the Mediterranean on boats as well, because we know that the early Egyptians were great boat makers, and their boats could easily sail across the Mediterranean. Yeah. And we also know that these very people, the very same people, the Hyksos people of Lower Egypt, were great friends with the Minoans. And of course, it was the Minoans who had been pushed out of Thera originally, and a lot of them had settled in northern Egypt with the Hyksos. That's why that they were there, because they were pushed out of their homeland by the Thera eruption. But of course the Minoans were the great sailors of that era. So now we have a people being pushed out of Egypt, and they have a complete navy to do it with. So we don't necessarily need an exodus across the Sinai Peninsula going up to Jerusalem. We can have an exodus that goes across the Mediterranean to any of the islands and any of the places in the Western Mediterranean. So these people who went out across the Mediterranean were the superpower of that era, and they find themselves in places like Sicily and Corsica and Malta, and the Balearic Islands in next to Spain, and they find themselves with almost uninhabited lands and with a people that were culturally and technologically far below them. So they were able, obviously, to take over these lands, to take over these peoples, to show them that the technology that they understood in terms of metallurgy, whatever it happens to be, weapon manufacture, whatever it was, and they could turn these people from being backward cultures into major rival civilizations. And this is why we suddenly see the sudden rise of Greece, of the Western Mediterranean, of the Spanish mainland, of the Balearic Islands. They all began to blossom in about this era. And this is why I think they did, because they were given this infusion of technology and knowledge from these people who had been evicted from Egypt. So they seeded new cultures and new civilizations all across the Mediterranean because of this one very event.
Incredible. That's, again, I think it's fascinating that it also validates in that sense, the Bible historically. But, do you think that in regards to the Bible, that it has been edited and so forth, or are you looking into other texts, apocryphal texts and so forth?
I look at all of them. The information is all there, but yes, it has been corrupted. So you have to be very careful about what it says. And if you read it correctly, you will find that the information is 100% correct and 100% original, as it was, almost verbatim. You just need to have to understand what it's talking about. And one of the classic ones is of Joseph going down into Egypt. Joseph goes into Egypt and he becomes prime minister, as I said before. And then his family come down. And he's a bit worried about this.